Welcome back. We are in module 6 and today we will start with lecture 4. In lecture 4 and 5 we will look at the discourse analysis, the domain of discourse analysis within this course. So, 2 lectures we will devote to them. So, discourse analysis, what is discourse analysis, and within discourse analysis what are the different types and what are the theories, that is what we will try to cover in these 2 lectures. Now, discourse, as the name suggests, basically takes us to the domain of interaction of various kinds. It can be spoken, it can be written, various kinds of conversations or discourses. So, it can basically these are long utterances, not just one sentence or for example, we have discussed in previous lectures how language can be an indicator of ideology, how it can be an indicator of identity and so on. So, many of those things are also discussed within discourse analysis, but here the most important difference is that the language, the part that we are discussing, that we will be focusing on, is a slightly longer piece of language output. So, language in social interaction typically will be structured around multiple variables. So, some of these variables we have talked about. So, social distance or solidarity, these are social variables, status, formality, function, these are social variables, basically the surrounding or the context. At the same time, you might also have some variables like participants, setting or social context, topic and purpose of interaction, and so on and so forth. Of course, we have put them as different categories, but as we will go ahead, you will see that they are actually intertwined with each other, very difficult to parse them. But these are basically what we study when we talk about discourse analysis. So, any kind of discourse, be it conversation or a longer discourse, these are variables that we look at. Now, so discourse analysis, basically what is it? It is a tool for researchers to understand how these variables interact in a conversation or any kind of longer discourses. There are social variables, there are individual variables, there are other kinds of cognitive variables as well. How in a discourse they are interrelated, how discourses are shaped by those variables, this is what we study in discourse analysis. So, discourse in this case, as I just said, refers to verbal or written language that are slightly longer. So, it is not like just one sentence, it will be slightly longer. For example, usually longer than just a sentence. So, as Janet Holmes talks about it as a stretch of spoken or written text. So, it can be any stretch, it can be a full conversation, it can be half a conversation, it can be a long paragraph, like that. So, basically a good enough amount of text, written or verbal, will be there. And this is what and describes. So, the discourse analyst will describe how it can be analyzed. So, depending on those various pointers in the conversation, how we can analyze the discourse, that is what discourse analysis is. Now, based on what is it that we are looking at, based on what are the variables that we are focusing on, discourse analysis can have many genres. So, we have included some here, many conversation analysis, critical discourse analysis, pragmatics, interactional sociolinguistics, ethnography of speaking, genre analysis, discursive psychology and speech act theory. There are a number of different genres within discourse analysis. So, it is not just one type, because each of them will focus on one type of variable. That is why we listed the variables in the beginning. Each of them have a different perspective on that. Now, we cannot discuss all of them. So, we will discuss conversation analysis and critical discourse analysis for this course. Now, conversation analysis, as the name suggests, this looks at conversations, how conversations are formed, how they are structured, what are the markers of conversation, what are the typical indicators of various kinds of conversation, that is what we look at in conversation analysis. So, we study the structure and organization of conversation, how people manage conversation, how conversations proceed in turns. This almost is like a given that there will be turns in a conversation, but not always, depending on different kinds of variables that might also be different. How one utterance relates to another, how topics are introduced, developed and changed, all of these are part of conversation analysis, and this is strictly text based. So, either it is a spoken or a written kind of a conversation, large data will be what our primary starting point is. So, we will start looking at that data only, and that is the point of departure. So, they are primarily the analysts will be concerned with orderliness of talk, because we are discussing talk as a skilled work. Now, if you have noticed, all of us are familiar with political speeches. Now, you can, it does not take us long, the very first sentence, the opening sentence of a speech tells us whether the person is going to be a good speaker or not so overwhelmingly a good speaker. What is it that we notice? That is what conversation analysis looks at. We immediately know, we instinctively know that this person is a good speaker, and after some time, of course, for example, and also we can even have further finer distinctions. So, Shashi Tharoor is of course hands down a very skilled person in terms of this kind of discourses, any kind of discourse, any kind of topic, any kind of surroundings, he aces it. So, what is it that he does? Of course, apart from the jargon that he uses, but there are other skills. So, those skills are what we look at here. So, this is an inductive approach that requires close examination of large collection of data, linguistic data. So, CA researcher, CA stands for conversation analysis. So, conversation analysis researcher would examine what comes before and what follows an utterance, together with attention to pauses, hesitations, false starts, intake of breath, intonation and similar other cues. If you think what is it that we look for, these are the things that a conversation analyst looks for. How do you change topics? How do you take pause? Where do you take pause? Are there hesitations in the beginning or in the end or in the when you are changing the topic? False starts, that is something that is very common for any kind of conversation, intake of breath, intonation pattern and so on. So, are you using a high pitched voice or you are using a low pitched voice, all kinds of things are analyzed in conversation analysis. How did this field come about? The background of CA actually goes back to sociology. It did not start within linguistics per se, it goes back all the way to the sociological context, where primarily it is traced back to Parsons and his work. His work was he is most well known for his work on authority, primarily professional authority. So, what is it, how does somebody have more authority of over another person in a conversation setup, in a social setup? What is it that he is, what is it that he brings to the table? In professional authority, which he calls professional authority, it comes from, this derives solely from what he calls a specific competence, a competence in a particular domain. His most well known work is in that of the medical domain. So, he talks about doctors. A doctor, when in a doctor's chamber, when a doctor is talking to a patient, that patient might be otherwise in a more authoritative position outside of that chamber, but inside the chamber the doctor has the authority. Why? Because of the specific competence, because the topic at hand, which is medical emergency of any kind of ailment, there in that specific domain the doctor is more knowledgeable. Hence, he has an authority over the other person. So, this is how he started discussing about power and authority and how there are different kinds. So, for example, real life manifestation of authority comes in two forms. That is what they say, that in sociology this is how it is understood. So, authority in knowledge and authority in action. Authority in knowledge, like the doctor having an authority to tell the patient what he thinks the problem is, and the patient is supposed to listen. Of course, in today's time many patients might just tell the doctor that no, I have googled my condition and I know this, that is a different story altogether. But in person's time this problem did not exist. So, doctor had the sole authority to tell the patient what the problem is, and authority in action is acting on that authority, like what you think you can. So, for example, a police personnel or social service people, they have an authority to act on certain things and people are supposed to abide by. So, that is how authority works in the social scenario. In conversation analysis, these two are referred as epistemic authority and deontic authority. So, the authority in knowledge is epistemic authority, authority in action is called deontic authority. Now, in conversation analysis, since a long time it has demonstrated how these two kinds of authorities are realized through designing utterances and their responses. We very carefully create our sentences, we carefully speak depending on the scenario, typically most of the time. When it does not, then we have memes. So, that is how that is why we have memes. So, somebody said something he was not supposed to say, he or she. So, the conversation analysis exactly demonstrates this, that a person's epistemic authority is expressed through this kind of a conversation structure, this kind of a sentence structure, and also the response to certain kinds of utterances. So, both of these are studied. So, epistemic authority is about following Searle, words to match the world, and deontics is about getting the world to match the words. So, in short, sociologists argued long before sociolinguistics talked about this, that talk is action. You can use your language, you can use your utterances, your sentences, your conversation as a form of action. In this case, in case of authority, to ascertain and to assert and to follow the authority. So, in linguistics, of course, in later times Bloomfield, Chomsky and others looked at language and meaning and interaction in different sub-disciplines across disciplines, followed by many other scholars like Himes, Gumpers and many others who have looked at actual interaction empirically. So, through gestures, through discourse, through performance and so on and so forth. And the field was, of course, in today's time, in later times by Sachs and Stegloff, further the study of interaction. So, this is the kind of a background to conversation analysis, where it started and how it is going. Now, we will look at some principles, the basic architecture of conversation analysis. There are few things that are part and parcel of conversation analysis. One of them is called adjacency pair. Adjacency pair is a fancy name given to the pattern in any given conversation. Every conversation, depending on the topic, have certain kinds of pre-given structure. So, there are one thing following another, that is always the case. So, a greeting leads to a return of greeting, a summon leads to a response, question leads to an answer, request to offer leads to an acceptance or refusal. This is called adjacency pair. So, if you ask some question to somebody, a teacher asking a question to the student, student answers, this is an adjacency pair, one thing following another, they typically go together, that is called adjacency pair. This is one of the first points of departure in case of conversation analysis. Is it following? For example, you have a piece of conversation and then you look at whether it is following the rule of adjacency pair. Is the question followed by an answer? If it is not, then why not? What is the speaker trying to convey by not answering, and so on. That is how it goes. So, adjacency pair starts at the very beginning, in the very first step of analysis. Some pairings have a choice. So, either you accept or reject a compliment, preferences over certain responses. So, acceptance is typically preferred over the rejections, answers over silence and so on. But these are, of course, these are culture specific. We have one example at the end that I have quoted. So, for example, acceptance, typically if somebody is offering you something, some help or some whatever, typically you will accept. But if you have to reject for whatever reasons the other person has, then there are certain discourse markers with which we make an introduction and follow it up with the rejection. But typically in most conversation setup, acceptance is the preferred choice. Similarly, answer over silence. So, if somebody is asking you something, you better answer rather than being silent when you are being asked something is considered rude in most cultures, not all, but most cultures. For example, in many Scandinavian countries, it is perfectly fine to sit next to another person and not say anything for long time and then just go your own way. Nobody will find it awkward or odd. These preferred responses are a marked choice typically and may cause disruptions or require explanations. So, what is expected is of course always typically will be there, but if the responses are the dispreferred one, then typically they will disrupt the conversation, or at least at the very least they will require some added explanations. For example, this is I have quoted from a paper. So, the friend 1 asked, do you want to go out for a drink tonight? Friend 2 marks his dispreferred reference with a discourse marker. The friend does not want to go, friend 2 does not want to go, but because rejection is the dispreferred option. So, what they do is they use a discourse marker. Oh, I would love to. So, that means you are already signaling that a disapproval is coming along, and then but I have to study for a test. So, explanation, first discourse marker followed by an explanation. So, this is a roundabout way of rejecting the proposal of going out for a drink. So, this is what it means when we say dispreferred versus preferred option. Adjacency pairing provides possibilities of continuity, because that is how conversations are carried forward, and exchange by enabling both parties to say something and for these somethings to be related, because this is how you put one thing after another and the conversation goes forward, and that is called a chaining effect. Most conversations follow the adjacency pair because adjacency pair leads to chaining effect. So, chaining effects can be of various types. Any textbook will give you these 2-3 kinds. So, one, for example, a question can lead to an answer, which can lead to a comment and lead to an acknowledgement, and so on, like this. This is a linear kind of a chain. So, typical telephone conversations, telephone rings, and then there is a response, there is a question and then answer. This is how it goes. So, this is one chain. There can be another kind of chain where there are question, answer, answer, rather than question, answer kind of thing. So, this is another example. These are all very typical type of conversations. So, it is possible by using this kind of a chain structure, it is possible to plot the structure of conversations using ideas of pairing and chaining. This is how you take the conversation forward. This is fine, this is what typically happens, but what if it does not happen? When it does not happen, what happens? What are the results of those violations? So, for example, not responding to a question, not commenting when solicited, not acknowledging a request, not exchanging a greeting, and so on. So, the consequences can be many depending on the context. So, that is where our social context comes into being. So, if it is a formal context, then violations might lead to something more serious as opposed to a non-formal, informal kind of a conversation. So, depending on the scenario, you will be either punished or you will not be punished. So, how many parts are there in any exchange? There are typically there will be 3: initiation, response, and there is a feedback. So, initiations, these are all culture specific often. So, beginning of a conversation usually involve an exchange of greetings. So, telephonic conversation starts with a hello, meeting between strangers, a formal sequence. So, first you have to say that my name is X and I am happy to meet you, whether you are happy or not does not matter, you have to say you are happy, and then the other person will also say a pleasure, my name is Y, and then because this is a formal exchange, it has a particular structure and typically people will follow. Meeting with close friends typically will have a specialized ritualistic beginning. Openings are mostly prescribed by setting. So, whatever is the setting, you will have a particular format. Now, Schleghoff talks about certain templates. So, summons, response, phone rings, and then hello, then the identification sequence, and then the greetings inquiry. But in certain cultures, this is not how it is. In Japan, for example, the caller speaks first and identifies himself or herself. In Netherlands and Sweden, people answer the phone by identifying themselves straight away. So, I am this who is on the other side kind. So, there is no other things before that. France, for example, a telephone call is an intrusion. The caller feels obligated to verify the number, identify himself, and be excused for intruding, the French being French. So, I am very sorry to disturb you kind of an opening, and then they go. go ahead. So, these are all culture specific, every culture has their own way. There have been very interesting studies on telephonic conversation, cross cultural differences in telephonic conversation. This is also part of what we call conversation analysis. And then comes the closing. Closing also is of course, there are certain universal patterns and then there are certain culture specific patterns. So, closings typically require a satisfactory close, not an abrupt closing. That is why when somebody hangs the phone without saying a bye or something, without signaling that they are about to hang up, it is considered rude, because in most cultures this is how it is, there has to be a closing. So, either you say bye or you say okay fine, let's agree on this or whatever, culture specific way of talking about it, but there has to be a closing. Typically most cultures prefer a closing. So, the various steps have been discussed in textbooks. So, closing down of the topic 1 o'clock then. So, some kind of an agreement was reached, pre-closing exchange okay and this kind of thing, thanks again. So, these are the typical patterns, but again these are culture specific. So, for example, one particular study looked at the instant messaging exchange in today's time. Of course, this is 2008 study, in today's time it has changed even more. So, he found two patterns of closing different from the face to face interactions. The first pattern, the expanded archetype sequence, a reason for leaving the chat is introduced. First they will say that there will be, I have some other work to do, and then eventually you leave the chat. Second pattern is partially automated closings. There are all kinds of automated messages these days. These days even emails have automated responses. So, that the conversation scenario has changed rapidly in the last couple of decades with AI and everything. So, things are changing, but even then there is a structure to the conversation. We have changed the structure within that pattern, but the overall pattern has not really changed. Another interesting part in any kind of conversation is the idea of feedback. So, adjacency pairs are integral to the turn taking system in a conversation, turn taking as in one person talking after another, that is how adjacency pair works. And another important aspect of this is the conversational feedback system. So, in any conversation the listener, the hearer has to, typically they give a feedback to the speaker. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they do not agree. So, basically they signal either verbally or non-verbally, they signal their agreement, encouragement, discouragement, whatever this might be, they do. But in some cases this also differs depending on the setting. In a formal setting you will be more restrained. So, you might just nod your head or simple some sounds like right, like this, but in a informal scenario, in a broader scenario, sometimes it might be more noisy. But the baseline is that the feedback system is always there in any kind of conversation setting. So, sometimes just paying attention, just having an attentive gaze, this is something that is actually being studied these days a lot, that people do not maintain eye contact. In many conversation setup, eye contact is missing. One reason is of course the eyes are fixed on the phone, but other reasons are like the attentive gaze is something that is part and parcel of a good conversation, but conversations have changed their structure over time, and today's time the attention span is of course has reduced. So, as a result of which attentive gaze as a positive feedback to the conversation is also slowly, if not completely missing, it is kind of becoming a rare thing. But so, this is about feedback. So, in any kind of conversation setting, feedback is an essential aspect. Turn taking. So, now we are looking at the bigger picture. So, both adjacency pair and the chain system and the feedback, they all are part of the turn taking system in a conversation setup. So, conversation, whether it is face to face, telephone or text, whatever, there is a turn. So, one person speaks, starts speaking, completes, and then another person speaks. Again, this is culture specific. In certain cultures it is perfectly fine for 5 people to speak at the same time. In many cultures this is exactly the opposite of it. So, if 2 people speak together, it is considered a disruption. But naturally most of the times, majority of the cases, taking turns is considered the part of the traffic rule of conversation. So, in most conversations one person will complete and then the other person. So, once a person speaks, it may be he or she might be reluctant to give up the space, the stage, so to say. So, in that case they might find various kinds of methods to continue speaking. So, like avoidance of eye contact is one such method that often they utilize. avoidance of eye contact with the listeners, stringing utterances together in a seamless manner, and so on. If one takes too much of time, it can be dangerous and it gets boring, which is called speechy in today's terminology. So, somebody is not giving the space to another person, then it is no more a conversation, it becomes a speech. So, in that sense. So, signals with turn taking, when they want to give up a turn or indicate end of turn, then what do people typically do? These are the indicators. The final syllable or final stretched syllable of an utterance may be prolonged. The pitch level of the voice drops in level on the final syllable. An utterance may be deliberately closed syntactically, use of you know or something like this. Similarly, there are body language as well, which are part of end of a turn signal, which is a relaxing posture, a gesture with a hand, or directing gaze at the listener. Directing gaze at the listener is one of the most telltale signs. The other gestures may not be very common across communities. Some communities may prefer a lot of gesturing. In some communities it might be not preferred, but directing the gaze from directly to the speaker, to the other person, is a clear signal that this might now it is your turn to speak. And of course, linguistic signals are these first four. So, this is how you signal taking a change of turn. This is called transition relevant place. These are some terms. The control over who speaks is called the floor management. Now, in any conversation there is also something called repair. Repairs are basically false starts or stammers or errors, corrections of various types, that is part of any kind of a normal spontaneous speech or a normal conversation. So, when there is some kind of a problem, then typically in English language at least, typically people will say sorry and then start over, or excuse me and then start over, or clarify the problem, the error or whatever. Slip of tongue is also very common. So, self repair is a very common part of conversations, because as soon as you have spoken, you have also heard the wrong utterance. So, you correct yourself. So, that is something very common. Every language has their own way of saying, correcting themselves. In German it is bitte for pardon. In English you say sorry or you say excuse me or whatever. So, there are various kinds of institutional setting in which this kind of conversations have been studied. So, institutional settings like classrooms or doctors. So, basically these are formal settings, any kind of formal settings. So, classrooms, teachers and students have a distinct role to play, each of them have a distinct role to play, which shapes turn taking, and the sequence, organization, repair practices all will differ. So, this is the from setting to setting they might be different, but each of these settings do have all of these things. So, turn taking will be there, adjacency pair will be there, chaining effect will be there, repair structure will be there. Only the within each of these categories there might be some differences depending on what the setting is. Similarly, doctor patient interaction is another. This has also been studied, as I said in the beginning, persons have studied this extensively. Even today it is being studied. So, Maynard for example introduced conversation analysis for medical educators to improve doctor patient communication. Often the communication fails because of the wrong usage. It may not be intentionally, but sometimes there are unintentional errors which leads to miscommunication. So, there are now studies taking place as to how to improve those communications, that is also one. And then any kind of analysis on conversation analysis needs to talk about the discourse markers. So, these are the typical ones, discourse markers, where you take a pause, you mark something that is about to follow. So, you say okay, well, right, these are things. So, each of them have a different function. Some of them are okay, for example, is a positive feedback, fine, I agree with you. But if you are saying well and then you have a falling tone, that means I do not completely agree with you, but okay, fine, let us go ahead and something like that. So, disagreement can be anticipated. In certain cases disagreement can be anticipated, and that is when you use these things. So, to sum up, the most crucial aspect of conversation analysis is that here the text is the sole point of discussion. No preconceived notions about the speakers, their positions, the way those positions might be used in language should bear upon the analysis. It should be the other way around. So, text is your point of departure. From that text you have to arrive at the structure. So, how is the chaining structure created, how is the discourse marker used, and from there you deduce your conclusions, not the other way around. So, data is primary always, and all relevant information should be deducible from the data, and relevant categories for analysis should arise out of the data. So, it has to be, so you have to understand through the text. So, one example I have added here as I was talking about it. So, Holmes gives an example like this. This is a conversation where this is a job interview. So, one person named Ben is being interviewed by a person called named Neil. Ben is an Asian immigrant, third generation, second generation or something. So, he is a bilingual Asian with near native competence of English. This is important because it is not that he does not understand English, but Holmes goes on showing. So, Ben has just told the interviewer that he applied for a job as a guard at an earlier stage and failed the test. He is looking for a job at the London Regional Transport Service, and he right now works in a different company called Rideways, and he was an applicant for a different post in the same company before, where he failed the test. This is the background, and now the conversation goes like this. So, Neil says, you failed the test at that stage, okay. This okay is important as a conversation marker, discourse marker, and since then you have worked as a process operator. What do you think London buses is going to offer you that Rideways do not offer you? London buses is the company where Ben has come for the interview, Rideways is where he is currently working. So, he is asking, what is it that we have that your current company does not have? Ben answers, well, quite a lot of things, for example, like Christmas bonus. Neil, and then Ben goes on, so many things, holidays and all that. Well, we get holidays and in Rideways, but we get here more holidays than you get in Rideway. You see where the what is interesting here is, Neil, when he asked what is it that our company has that the previous company did not, he did not really want to know about the holidays and all those perks. This was a surface question. What he was actually asking is, what is it that you can do here better that you cannot do better. So, basically what is it that you are bringing to the company? Why should we hire you, frankly speaking? But he put it in a nice way. Ben could not understand the deeper question, and he answered simply the surface question, and very naively he answered that I get bonus, I get holidays, more holidays here and so on. And at the end Neil was not quite happy. He says all right with a falling tone. So, this is what conversation analysis is all about. So, when you hear Ben's response and compare it with Neil's response, you understand that there was some gap somewhere and Neil understood what he had to understand. So, this is how conversation analysis goes. So, as Lidikar says that as an empirical discipline, conversation analysis allows order to emerge from the data. From the data itself you understand what is happening, you do not need any theoretical, no intervening layer of theoretical constructs are necessary, and allows for the determination of the organizing principles that are used and oriented to by the speakers themselves. So, this is how there is another very interesting thing that comes to mind. This is in one of those textbooks in sociolinguistics. So, there is this research lab, the professor calls from his office to the lab, and one of the students picks up, and the student picks up and he says hello, he says hi, I am whatever he was, and then so he does not, and the other person identifies himself saying I am X. So, he is the professor whose lab this person is working, and this person, the student who responds, he is an Asian. So, he spent the next 2-3 days, he spent absolutely anxious that the professor might be very annoyed and offended that he did not greet him in the right way. But the professor, being an American, did not think anything about it. So, this is where cross cultural differences occur. So, in Asian cultures, we think the respect given to the superiors in whatever way, age or position or education and all that, this is a given. We make it, our conversations show that, and in this case, because his response was very casual, he thought he will be thrown out of the lab very soon, but that did not happen. So, this is how conversation. So, these ideas you get from the data itself, the conversation itself you can get the data without theorizing much about it. So, that is the most interesting thing about conversation analysis, and this is how we can sum up, this is how the importance of conversation analysis has been put together. All of these organizations of practice like turn taking, turn organization, action formation, sequence organization, etc., etc., they operate together all the time to inform the participants co-construction of the observable actual conduct in interaction, that is prima facie. So, how two people discussing, talking about something, how they construct something out of thin air using language, and how that tells us a lot more about how organizing something in real time happens. So, sometimes not all conversations are pre-given. So, a classroom conversation is a almost preset, we know how it is going to go. Doctor's chamber, we know how it is going to go, but in real life that is not how it always works. So, in real life how does it really go is something that we study in conversation analysis. So, only by understanding them one by one will get into the position to observe them all together. So, you take each of these variables separately and see how they are structured together, and that gives you the whole picture. So, that is how it is summed up. So, this is where we complete lecture 4. In the next lecture, we will talk about critical discourse analysis. Thank you.